Today we explore the big C. What is that, you ask? Stay tuned and we will give you some expert tips on how to deal with the inevitable set of compromises that home buyers are confronted with.
Welcome to Your First Home Buyer Guide, the podcast for first home buyers who want to move it along and become homeowners. But most importantly, it is for you to become an educated home buyer.
I'm Meighan and that was Veronica. We're both buyer's agents and probably old enough to be your mum. But it's a good thing because between us we've got over 45 years experience to share with you and bucket loads of stories about avoidable mistakes. Together, we're going to make sure you get unbiased and real information you can rely on. Allow us to guide you on your home buying journey. We want you to become an educated home buyer so that you can stop looking for your first home and actually become a proud homeowner.
We've got loads of great tips for you in this episode, and if you'd like more useful tools, head over to the website homebuyeracademy.com.au, and there you'll get access to our free mini course, How to Price a Property Like a Professional. You will also find the holy grail of home buying education, Your First Home Buyer Guide, the online course for people who want to become educated home buyers. We created this for you to help you get on the right path to home ownership for your first home and beyond.
But before we get into the interesting stuff in this week's episode, we've got the boring bit, the disclaimer. You of course know that nothing in this podcast is to be taken as personal advice. We always recommend getting the advice of an expert in their field who takes the time to understand your personal situation. We've done our very best to ensure that the content is correct at the time of recording. Things change rapidly, so always check with the relevant government authority and your trusted advisors to get the most up-to-date information.
Today we're talking about the C word. I know what you're thinking. It's compromise. But before we get into that, what's your special house in the video behind you this week, Meighan?
So for our listeners who know that I have had trouble finding a picture of my first house when I bought it. I've shown examples of similar houses, but this is actually it. This is my brother and I in front of our almost derelict workers' cottage that we bought back in 1998. Now, we had so many compromises that we had to make here. Price wasn't one of them because that was pretty much set in stone. What we could afford was what we could afford. Position, we compromised quite heavily on. And condition or property, you can see she was coming off of stumps in some places.
She's looking a bit like an ugly duckling.
Look at us.
Well, there you go.
So
you should definitely tune in because that is one prehistoric looking house. All right. There was a recent survey, right? Meighan uncovered this, a survey by Bankwest that found that 78% of young aspiring home buyers were prepared to cut back on property features in order to buy a house. And that's a good thing because you have to cut back on something. I mean, basically we all need to compromise on something. So 78%.
But it's not a new thing, Veronica, and this is the thing that I find really quite interesting at the moment. I mean, we'll get to it, but compromising is not a new thing. We've all had to do it.
Oh, I know. And look, most home buyers are never going to get anywhere without compromising. So, and I say most because there's always an element of luck, or if somebody has got really rich parents and they can just afford to throw as much money as you need, then fine. But most of us don't fall into that category.
Absolutely. Look, for those of you who have done our Where to Buy tutorial, which is also part of Your First Home Buyer Guide, our flagship course, you'll know all about how to work out your own unique set of compromises using our 3P process. Veronica, the 3Ps?
Position, property, and or price. And so
we're going to go into that now. Let's have a look at what the rest of the country thinks about these compromises.
Oh, just quickly before we do, because the premise behind this is that you've got 3Ps in any property search. If you haven't done our Where to Buy workshop, or if you haven't heard us talk about it before, there's the position or the location of the property. There's the property itself. It could be the condition of the property, or it could be the size of it, or it could be a unit versus a house. So something to do with the property characteristics. And then there's the third P, which is price or your budget, right? One of those Ps will always move more or flex more than the other two Ps. So that's what compromise is, which is the one that's going to compromise.
Or one might not be able to flex at all.
Or exactly. Yeah. So if two are fixed, one is definitely going to have to flex. So,
yeah.
And that's what this is all about, working out the unique blend of how those compromises fit in your circumstances, right? So yes, moving back to the survey, Meighan.
Now, in this survey called Home Truths, which was done by Bankwest, and they do it regularly, right? So they can actually monitor how people's preparedness to compromise in certain things changes over time. It was mostly based on West Australian buyers, but they also provided data for the East Coast. So, it's not quite Australia-wide, but it kind of is. Now, the survey broke down the data by generation. So they're talking particularly about what things Generation Z will compromise on, millennials, Gen X and boomers. So across most of the home buying community. Now, overall, the generations had increased their willingness to compromise in all areas except the boomers. They were almost unanimous in their staunch refusal to compromise on anything. But Veronica, I think they've earned it.
Well, that's sort of interesting, isn't it? Because most of our listeners, I would hazard, would be Gen Z or millennials. Although we do have Gen X and we're both Gen X, but
we're Gen X. Yeah,
we do have some Gen X listeners who are actually buying their first home in their 40s and 50s, right? Boomers typically are not buying their first home. Boomers are that bit older, right? Basically,
sort of 59 plus. They're about
they're all turning
79.
60. The youngest boomer is turning 60 this year.
Yeah.
And most of them, might be looking at downsizing. And that's it's a whole other podcast. We haven't done your last home buyer guide. That's the next one for us. Your last home buyer
write down
guide.
for another time. But it actually is just a sidebar. That is an increasing part of our buyer's agent business is actually the downsizing market. So your last home actually could be quite, it is a growing market.
Yeah. And so an issue there, though.
Long way off for you, though, guys.
Exactly. And I can understand why boomers don't want to compromise because this is a quote that actually was said to me by a boomer that we were helping buy in Wagga, right, for the show, Location Australia, a long time ago now. And she said to me, Veronica, we're downsizing, we're not downgrading, right?
Love it.
So they're selling something big and buying something smaller. They've got money to spare, so they don't have to compromise. But for the rest of us, we have to compromise. All right.
And it doesn't matter, Veronica, if you've got $500,000 or $5 million. We work in our buyer's agency businesses with people at a broad range of price ranges, and every single one of them has to have a conversation about compromises because nothing is perfect.
Yep.
And it doesn't matter if you increase your budget. Something's still got to give.
Exactly right. In fact, I was just reviewing a property I bought a couple of years ago for $13 million, and that client had to compromise on things too.
There you go.
So, it's amazing.
It's not new. It's been around for a long time.
Exactly
and
right.
We're always going to have to do it.
Yeah. And so get used to it, right? So don't feel it's just except for the boomers.
It's not just this
everyone
generation.
has to deal with it.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. So we looked at the results of the survey to see where home buyers are most prepared to compromise on their 3P. So we sort of organised the survey results to fit in with our 3P methodology. Okay. So the first P in this situation is price. Now, the survey assumes that the respondents actually had their price fixed. So the questions were around, with your budget. So the budget in the respondent's mind, fixed. So that one, in this case, can't be changed. The compromises had to be around the property features and the position or location of the property. However, Veronica, for some of our listeners, price might be the thing that they are able to compromise on. They might have set a limit for themselves that's below what their borrowing capacity is.
And this is something that we do talk about in many, many of our episodes, and that is a couple of things here. I'm thinking three things. The first one is government grants. People wanting to qualify for free money from the government. So, for example, you're wanting to get free stamp duty, and that if that caps you at a price of, say, 800,000 or 600,000 or whatever it is it caps you at, but you are actually able to afford a bigger property, a bigger, better property, better located property, whatever, you actually could afford something bigger, better that would suit you for longer and actually would be a better decision for you. That is where the price P should flex. And when you've got the opportunity to do so, And that might be that you've got, your income is better, you've got a bigger deposit or whatever. And so rather than constrain yourself because of that free money from the government, you're actually cutting your nose up to spite your face a bit. Another approach to that too, some people want to avoid LMI or lenders mortgage insurance at all costs, but there are times when it makes sense if you could afford a bigger mortgage, and it all comes down to your income and your affordability and lots of other issues there. Talking to your broker about this is really important, because if you are limiting yourself because you don't want to pay lenders mortgage insurance, however, if you did so, it allowed you to buy a bigger property that you're going to be able to grow into or be in for longer, then that's a discussion well worth having with your broker. So, and then the other one, the P one, where you might have more flex, is if your parents want to help you out, but you all sort of go, no, I want to do it on my own. Like mind you, I know more and more parents and grandparents are helping out people, but sometimes it's a good idea, other times it is not. All these things should be taken with great consideration.
And we did an episode on families sort of working together. We'll pop that in the show notes, that one. Because there's a lot that you have to think about if you're going to go down that pathway in terms of agreements and discussions around what ifs, what if you partner up and what if you want to sell and what if, all these things. So lots and lots of things to think about, but it is something to think about and keep in mind, because I think your key point there, Veronica, and you even experienced this yourself and you've talked about in the podcast a number of times, is when it feels more comfortable to purchase a property that's cheaper, it can sometimes cost you more in the long run if you outgrow that property really quickly. So the idea of really saying to yourself, well, am I fixing this price for the wrong reasons? If I actually went to what I could afford, would it mean that I wouldn't have to upgrade as quickly and therefore save a lot more money in the long term from having to sell and buy again? So it's a bigger picture, looking at how long you're going to be there, how long is it going to serve you, and are you holding yourself back for the wrong reasons financially when you're looking at price? And that's very, very unique to you, and a discussion that has to be had with the professionals who are experts in that area, in mortgage broker, financial advisor, or accountant.
Yep. And so that's the price P out of the way. Let's look at the property P, or the property features.
Yep. Now, this in the survey centered around property preferences. Now, I didn't see the question itself, so I'm not talking about the methodology of this. We're just kind of saying what was reported. So in this one, Gen Z were most likely to compromise on the features of a property or their property preferences at 88%. So 88% of the respondents in Gen Z were prepared to compromise on property preferences. 73% of millennials in Western Australia were prepared to compromise on property preferences. Was about the same on the East Coast. About 73% were prepared to compromise on the property preferences. Now, that might be things like whether it's a unit or a townhouse, or whether it was house and land package or established. Those sorts of things are what we talk about when we talk about property preferences in this survey.
So interesting, because the younger ones are more willing to compromise, which could reflect the fact that at a younger age, you might have less money, perhaps, and you have a recognition that you're going to have to compromise, whereas the more you save, the more you earn, you might think, I shouldn't have to compromise. So there could be a mindset thing there as well. It's sort of interesting. But, we know everyone has to compromise. So the very fact that you've got 12% of Gen Zs, not willing to
not
compromise.
Prepared to compromise.
Probably the ones that aren't going to buy. And millennials, 27% probably not going to buy. But what's the East Coast
unless
figure?
they can really adjust their price or their position.
Yeah.
So, and that's the other thing. They might be looking at those. They might not even know that there's a methodology for them to work this out.
Yeah.
But they might say, no, I absolutely have to have this in the property, so I'll pay more. Like, that might be their compromise.
Or, they're going to relocate. But let's look at some of those features that they were prepared to move on. And one is the smaller property than they want.
Yeah. Gen Z, 43%. So less than half of Gen Z were prepared to have a property that was smaller than what they wanted in order to purchase. Millennials, less likely, even less likely at 33%. And on the East Coast, that was lower again at 31%. So if, let's say, really wanted a 3-bedroom house, less than a third of people are prepared to go down to a 2-bedroom house in order to get into the property market. So that was just not a compromise they were prepared to make.
I like the ones that are willing to sacrifice luxuries like a pool or a deck. I mean, can I have a pool and a deck?
Years ago, I think in about 2006, I wrote an article. So even back in 2006, we were talking about unaffordability and how hard it was for first-time buyers to get into the market way back then. And I wrote an article about there being an expectation crisis as opposed to
that's
housing
gold.
crisis.
There you go.
Because, back then people were wanting the 4-bedroom house with the pool or the deck or whatever that was. But it was what are you prepared to compromise on to actually make this happen, to get into the market, to get into that first time? So sacrificing luxuries like a pool or a deck, Gen Z, 54%, so more than half of Gen Z were prepared to do that. Good on them. They don't need that pool over in Western Australia. Millennials, much less so. 33% were not prepared to give up their luxuries or their lifestyle elements, I guess you'd say. And on the East Coast, that sat at around 42% being prepared to compromise on letting go of the luxuries of life.
That's funny. But the interesting now, though, that the compromise on position, right? So that's really interesting because that then moves, okay, if I'm not prepared to compromise on the price, right? If I can't add more money to the kitty, and I'm not prepared to compromise on the property itself, features in the property, size of property, all that sort of stuff, then I'm going to have to be either not buying or I'm compromising on position. And so you would expect it to be inversely proportionate, wouldn't you? You go, okay, well, if how many Gen Zs were prepared to compromise on the property? 88%. You think, oh, well, the remaining 12 must be prepared to compromise on position. But do we have the
Gen Z? Up.
It doesn't add up, does it?
It just doesn't add up. I don't think they understand that it should add up to 100.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, it's like obviously we
jest.
We do jest because it would be neat if it did add up to 100, but clearly Gen Zs, 54% are prepared to compromise on location. So they are the most flexible by far when you combine both the flexibility on the property and the location. So I guess that's a
Gen
practicality.
X were up there as well. So Gen X were prepared to compromise quite a lot on position as well.
Yeah, but the thing is with Gen X, like Gen X will need the space. Like if you've got 4 kids and, 2 of them in high school, one's at university, whatever, you don't have the luxury of being able to go smaller. Yeah. Like you have to. Whereas if you're younger and you haven't yet had all your kids or they're still little, you can actually compromise on space more when your family is younger. So I think that's a generational thing.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of variables too, because when your children are younger and you're sourcing a location, sometimes where you need to be sits around a school catchment area. And that's very hard to compromise on if you're looking at schooling as being important for your young children. So there's obviously a lot of things behind this, but I found this really interesting, that the whole, one, the methodology and the questions that they ask, but 2, just the slight differences or the differences between the different generations. Now, if we look at moving to a cheaper suburb as an option, then Gen Z were more likely than everybody to compromise on moving to a cheaper suburb. So 41% of Gen Z said that they would go to a cheaper suburb in order to get into the market. On the East Coast, that was about 36%. But this is the thing that I found really fascinating, and this is really what drew me to the article, and that is that 68% of Gen Z were prepared to compromise on the safety of a suburb, stating it was not an important feature to them.
And 50% of millennials as well. Yes. In WA. These two
that just blew my mind.
Well, it is interesting, isn't it? Because particularly in WA at the moment, and we all have to think about this, when we're buying property, we are all to a degree at the mercy of whatever market conditions happen to be in play at the time that we decide to buy property.
Yeah.
Right. We can become an expert in our little local area where we're looking in those market conditions. And what we fail to understand is that the property market is cyclical. And particularly in WA, FOMO at the moment is driving the property market in Perth at the moment, right? And so I would guess that FOMO is playing into some of these responses. And this is why it's interesting that they draw a distinction between the East Coast and the West Coast,
I think
right?
it's because they're based in Western Australia.
Got to make it feel like they're actually
sample sizes largely drawn from there, and then they've got a smattering from the East Coast.
Yeah. So, but the point being though, that if you are feeling that there's pressure, prices are rising so fast, and Perth is experiencing a lot of rapid price growth at the moment, you're under pressure that prices are rising so fast, you have to desperately get into the market. You are willing to compromise on things that you would not compromise on if the market felt like it was more under control. And that's where the safety thing, I think, comes into it. And that's rather interesting. It's a bit like, in a super hot market, you ask people, would you buy on a main road if it meant you could be in your number one suburb? And more people will say yes in a super hot market than they would in a flat market. And they go, no way, I wouldn't buy on a main road. No way, no way, no way. And that's because FOMO isn't driving decisions in a slow property market. But buyers don't know that. They only know how they're reacting at the time that they're looking at buying. We know it because we're professionals. We sit back and go, wow, I can see FOMO driving those decisions, or I can see, a level of control those buyers think that they have at the moment because there is no FOMO in a different market, right? And I think that safety thing is really interesting, that people are going, doesn't matter anymore. I don't care. I just want to get in the market.
And Veronica, we do have a student who has been part of Campfire who has told us that she's quite comfortable to buy in a suburb that perhaps hasn't got the best reputation for safety or security or socio-demographics. That's a compromise that they're prepared to make. Now, we've talked through this with her, and we've pressure tested her around this, and she's grown up in this kind of environment, so she's very comfortable with it. So for some people, I think it's about being eyes wide open and really understanding what that community is that you're going into, and are they people like you and you feel comfortable with that? And, if things are happening around you, that you have the things that can protect you. But if the suburb safety is a compromise, make sure you really understand what that means, and you've immersed yourself in that community, and you really aren't going to get in there and lock yourself in the house and never want to leave again.
and look, this is interesting because, like in her example, in her situation, she grew up there, so she knows what she's in for. She knows
what it's like. She understands
opposed to others who are saying, it doesn't matter, but they're actually not aware. There's two very different type of buyer. And we very much, both of us, have the motto that really eyes wide open. You make decisions, and everything's a compromise when it comes to buying property. As I said, unless you've got super rich parents, or you just won a lot
or whatever. Compromise.
Probably still going to compromise.
There is no perfection. There is no perfection.
So therefore, coming to grips with what you're prepared to compromise on, and making longer term decisions. I think that's the other theme. I guess what we're talking through this whole
very much so
episode is that any decision that you make today, feeling under pressure, trying to get into the market, depending on where, in the country you're buying, you live, act in haste, live in, repent at leisure. The point being that your decisions today have long-term ramifications for your life and your financial future and your own security, your personal security.
Yeah.
So it's worthwhile really spending a little bit of time on this compromise piece to really
absolutely
move those dials and work out really what for you is the immovable stuff and what is really important to keep fixed.
And it's important not to ask other people for their opinions on this. Gather information from other people, but don't form opinions. And why I say that is we often see in online forums that can be helpful, but we often see in online forums people saying, oh, we don't know whether to, go for a unit or a house. What do you think's best? Well, how could anyone possibly answer that question without knowing the family dynamics, where you are in your situation in life, what your budget is, so it's very dangerous to ask people to give you an opinion on a compromise when the big picture isn't known, which is why it's so important to do the work yourself, you on your own or you with your partner, depending on how you're buying, and do the work to understand for yourself what are the compromises in those three areas: price, position, property. And once you've got a really clear understanding of that, it is so much easier to do your search because you can target and you can have flexible searches and you can have multiple searches going depending on your compromises. So, Veronica, we talk about in the 3P tutorial, we talk about you might have 3 different sets of compromises that you're happy to work with. It might be in that suburb where, let's say, if I could buy in Bondi, I would accept a 2-bedroom unit, but I wouldn't accept a 2-bedroom unit. Give me another suburb in Sydney in Randwick. I wouldn't accept because I know that I can afford better there. So that set of compromises is 2 different searches.
Yeah.
Both compromises might be right for you, but you're running 2 different searches.
Yeah. And, sometimes people really don't know until they actually find the right property. They're not even 100% clear what is more valuable to them. And that's why you do need to run those 2 searches if that's in, where you're at. So in that example, say if you wanted to look in Bondi because, I want to be really, really super close to the beach and I would compromise, I would suffer, I would sacrifice a bedroom if I could be that close. Versus if I'm going to be around Randwick, I want to be totally comfortable. I want all the sides that I really, really, really need. And I know that I'm going to get in the car to go to the beach or whatever. And that part of my life won't be as easy and I'm prepared to do that. So, and sometimes it's all academic. If you only look in one area, if you only look in Bondi, it's still at the back of your mind. You're going to be having that thing in your head going, oh, but it's a bit small. It's a bit small. And if you look in Randwick only, you're going to have that thing in the back of your mind, oh, but it's a bit far from the beach.
Yeah.
You look at them side by side and you look at the smaller ones in the better location and the larger ones somewhere else. Honestly, when you find the right one, it'll go, bing, that's the one. Because you really have been weighing them up and looking at them honestly. So I always say that that's a really great way to approach it. If you do have those sort of competing ideas about what you may or may not be prepared to flex on.
Yeah, but it also stops you wasting time searching for the wrong thing in the wrong place because you're not going to get that 3-bedroom unit in Bondi with your budget if your budget's fixed, if that makes sense. But you'll get the 3-bedroom in Randwick if your budget is set. So incredibly important to do the process so that you're not wasting time looking for the unicorn, the needle in the haystack that actually doesn't exist.
All right, quick note. You might think that we cover everything you need to know on these podcasts, but a word of warning, we do not. We're just scratching the surface. And particularly in this one, there's a tiny, tiny, tiny piece of a tutorial, which is a tiny piece of the whole program that you need to learn step by step to buy your own property. If you want to be an educated first home buyer, you really need to learn all of these steps and how to do everything in the right order.
Our First Home Buyer Guide course only costs $990 and you get direct access to us to help guide you through your negotiations. You can also share a link of any property you're thinking of buying and we can help you work out whether it's A, B or C grade or an absolute no-go zone. We also will stress test you on your 3 Ps. We did that. We've done that in the last couple of campfires with people. Now, trust me, you'll buy better with our guidance and you'll overpay by a lot more than $1,000 if you don't know what you're doing. In this episode, we've only touched on a tiny part of the huge amount of things you need to know to become an educated first home buyer. There is so much more for you to do. You can learn all of the steps in the right order and avoid all of the mistakes that others have made in our 10-step online course for first home buyers.
If you'd like to learn more about the right process and avoid making rookie errors, become an educated home buyer. Head over to the website, check out your First Home Buyer Guide, the course that we have created for you. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss an episode. And if you've liked what you've heard today, please give us an iTunes review. It helps other people find us. And of course, I know it's a bit cringy, but we're going to ask for 5 stars. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you found this really useful. And if you have, please share the love with others who you know are in the same boat. We'll be back next week with more priceless stuff.